Hello everybody, my name is Mr. Rader and this video is for students taking participation in government. And in this video we'll introduce the structured paragraph tool looking at day 24, thinking about characteristics of judicial independence. And the question that you'll be asked to answer or that you've already been asked to answer in your social studies class is, to what extent is the US judiciary independent and what impact does that have on our democracy? So the first thing I would recommend you do, and it's in the introduction part of the lesson on the Google Slides, is if you're not sure what judicial independence is, go to the hyperlink for a review on judicial independence using the Understanding Democracy, a Hip Pocket Guide. And just reading the first paragraph, the judicial component of government is independent in order to insulate its members from punitive or coercive actions by the legislative and executive departments of the government. If the judiciary is independent, then it can make fair decisions that uphold the rule of law, an essential element of any genuine constitutional democracy. So this tells us why it's important for the judicial branch to remain independent. And then the second paragraph talks about two ways that judicial independence is protected under the Constitution, looking at Article 3. So if you want to take a moment and pause and read that, that would be great. And then going back to the structured paragraph tool, we want to think about how we might organize our paragraph to really effectively convey our position on the prompt to our readers. So when we think about a good paragraph, we'll start with our topic sentence. And we'll want to consider what are the characteristics of judicial independence. So my recommendation, this is what I tell my students, is to think about 2 or 3 characteristics of judicial independence to actually discuss in your paragraph. And most likely your teacher had you read 1 or 2 characteristics of judicial independence in small groups when you were in class. And the 5 components are appointment and promotion of judges, judicial councils, terms and conditions of judicial tenure, financial autonomy and court administration, and then judicial conduct and discipline. And we'll look at one sample reading in a few moments. But when we think about the next part of the paragraph, we want to provide context for our readers. We want to try to engage our audience and to help them to really understand just the general background information that they'll need to understand what judicial independence is, so that if we're going to be making a claim that in the United States that the US judiciary is independent or is somewhat independent or is not really independent, we can have some very clear evidence to support our positions. We want to again think about that, providing that short summary of key ideas and concepts to direct the reader to a particular train of thought. And we want to think about, again, what information that we are conveying to our readers. If this was a larger essay, maybe we'd want to consider what we covered in our previous paragraphs. But since this is just a 1 paragraph response, we could ignore that for now and really focus on introducing our evidence. And this is where you can introduce your examples to explain to your audience your position on judicial independence and how your characteristic really supports that. And this is where you will have to rely on your classmates to help you with a second or third characteristic of judicial independence. Or conversely, if you're working independently on this, you'll have to read 2 or 3 to really get a greater sense of the various characteristics. And this is where you should also use parenthetical citations. So for the article that is linked here, and it's the one that you would use for this assignment, you would cite the organization name, since there's no official writer listed, so you can't cite their last name, but we could cite the organization, the date, the year of publication, and then we can reference the paragraph number as well. That's what the paragraph section is, especially if we're doing here APA citations, we can make that notation as well. So we'd also want to present our evidence and really think about how we might present this evidence, whether it be quotations, statistics, or describing data to our audience. And then we want to discuss and interpret our information, right? We want to think about how our evidence ultimately relates to our topic, main idea, or thesis that we're trying to convert. So my recommendation, and I've said this to my students all the time, is to start your paragraph using the turn that question around strategy. So if we're thinking about this question, to what extent is the US judiciary independent, right? And what impact does that have on our democracy? We can think about how to phrase these things. So if we want to allow for some flexibility in our response, we can use a phrase including mostly independent. So you can see I'm highlighting that there just to illustrate that point to you. The U.S. judiciary is mostly independent because they have the ability to interpret the laws passed by the Congress and determine whether or not they are constitutional, right? That's the foundations of judicial review, which was covered in another video in the series on judicial review. But individual judges may be dependent on members of Congress, particularly the Senate, in order to be confirmed as justices at various levels in the federal court system, including the Supreme Court of the United States, or SCOTUS, right? So going back briefly to the PowerPoint and the reading for the lesson, you'll read your assigned section of the main factors aimed at securing judicial independence around the world. And you'll think about your characteristic, again, most likely one of the five, perhaps two of the five. You'll consider real-world examples of that characteristic and how it's been applied. Consider any parallels that you may be aware of in the U.S. judicial system. And then as a group, you'll want to consider, given the UN criteria, to what extent are U.S. courts independent. So when we look at the reading itself, we have the introduction to this article on the main factors aimed at securing judicial independence. And then as we scroll down, each section is clearly identified by a section heading. We consider how judges are appointed. And after the introduction, we can see real world examples on how this is actually done. So we see an example here in Jordan, Kenya, England, Wales, and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. So one thing that you can do if you want to be able to annotate the text, you can highlight the section of the text that you want to use. You can press Control-C if you're on a PC, or Command-C if you're on a Apple computer, and you could paste it directly into the lesson. So that's what I did here. And then you could easily then highlight by going over the material, clicking your highlighting color, choose the color of your choice. You can insert comments directly into the document, whatever allows you to best take notes and really understand the points that are being made. And one last comment before we end, notice even here in this citation that they included, we see the organization, the year of their publication they're citing, and in this case, paragraphs 53 to 55 is the information that they are citing in their own report. So when we think about the structured paragraph tool, we want to consider it as a way to help us add more details to our writing and to really help us to focus on the main points that we want to convey to our audience. Okay, that'll do it. I hope everybody has a great day.